Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend Stephen Erikson. Hello, Steve.
Hi, yeah, and this, of course, is a continuation of a conversation we started, well, about an hour ago. And we decided let's record this because it actually is about narrative structure, prose, style, characterization, character, as two different things, by the way.
Well, okay, so yes, we were having a conversation, and then
We were.
as sometimes happens, you go, we really should have started recording about an hour ago when we started talking about this. But what to set it up for people, we were discussing different approaches to creative writing and looking at it from an author's perspective, from a reader's perspective, and trying to understand that different terms are used in different ways with different weights and different priorities. Would that be a fair summation of what we were discussing?
Yeah, and I think at least the genesis from my side was I was mentioning things that I'm writing about in my book on writing. And my lifelong now observation that a creative writing program does not automatically confer uh, the understanding of narrative structure because sometimes it's just not even in the curriculum. Um, and so its absence is often very noticeable when in conversation with various people. So basically, as much as in the book on writing, I'll say that creative writing programs are great. They're useful, um, but you need to really pick and choose. And not only that, unlike your average university course, which its virtues and qualities are quite often dependent on the textbooks being read or the labs being conducted and all the rest. Creative writing programs are almost entirely dependent on how good the teacher is. So
Well, just as a small addendum to that point, I find that even even with the teaching of English literature or any of these sorts of subjects, you can have the world's greatest text that you're working from with your students. But you, as a lecturer, as an educator, you need to help your students access it. And so I think all subjects, the strength of the educator, the strength of the lecturer will always come to the fore. And you can have five different classes all working from the same text. But for some reason, well, a composition class is one thing, but also certain lecturers just they're able to inspire you and make the text open up and become transparent in a way that other lecturers just don't. And some people have that gift. And I was so lucky going through university to meet some brilliant lecturers who, through their passion for something, their understanding, and their ability to communicate it, opened up possibilities that the same passage you've been reading time and time and time again just go, I just don't get this. And then
yeah,
with one analogy or one very short point and explanatory note, you go, oh, well, why didn't they say that? And of course, the lecturer would look at you and go, they did. But
yeah, yeah. It's the same for me. I feel extremely lucky. But it was the undergraduate program at UVic, and it really was founded upon one writer teacher um, for whom this was their greatest passion, narrative structure. And so it's like nobody else in that department was teaching that particular lecture, that particular class. It was just one guy, and he was amazing. But in conversations with lots of people and looking at other writing programs, um, quite often that element is just not there. It's not part of the program. Um, and that's a shame because narrative structure, and of course what can happen is later on somebody's writing books or somebody's even teaching and all the rest, and you watch them on YouTube, and they're conflating things like prose and style, which are two very different things. um and and it's frustrating to listen to because you're thinking, no, prose is this, prose is at this level, style is it's underneath all of that stuff, but also separate. So
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about structure, because obviously, I have a penchant for narrative structure. And the on the one hand, if you set out narrative structure and you use something like Freytag's pyramid or something like that, the the problem is when people take it as a blueprint, as something prescriptive, instead of understanding what Freytag was actually expressing, which is an understanding of the movement and stresses within a narrative. Because if we think narrative events are things that happen to characters, characters experience narrative events. You can have a whole sequence of really cool things happening, but there needs to be a level of connectivity between them in order to turn it into narrative, because otherwise it's just a sequence of random events. And we want something that has a level of connectivity, a level of cohesion. And that can be done in numerous ways. You can do it thematically. So you create a sequence of short stories, all exploring a different theme, or all exploring the same theme, but in different ways. And that provides a thematic connection running through everything. But then the individual short story still has to have a structure.
mm-hmm.
And one of the fascinating things about structure, there's so many different ways of doing it that it's not prescriptive. It's trying to find and understand the skeleton that all of the narrative flesh is being held together by and given shape by. And I my two favorite things, the narratological sort of structuralism approach and looking at these big movements, and close reading, looking at the very specific words on the page, which, two very different schools of literary theory.
Mm-hmm.
But if everything was just done on that close reading level, you would have a giant amorphous blob of really interesting narrative flesh. If everything is just structural, then you have the bare bones skeleton of a story, but it's not built out. It doesn't it's not engaging. It's just the skeleton of the thing. And it's when the two come together, when the narrative flesh that we get from the expression, the characters, the events, and how that connective tissue is running through and joining things together over this skeleton, that we get the entire shape of the narrative, the finished story beast. And that would be my initial approach to talking about this stuff.
Yeah, and it's different. It's different for a writer's approach. And I remember, especially in the undergraduate workshops, where basically you're dealing with, we're all new to the game, as it were. And the approach generally was, you concentrate on the equivalent of close reading, right? But it's close writing. And so that's where the terminology that I drop a lot regarding narrative structure comes in. So you're looking at plot, you're looking at setting, you're looking at tense, you're looking at point of view, you're looking at tone, atmosphere, style, theme, psychic distance, characterization, and so on,
Diction.
right? So, sorry?
Diction. The
Diction levels, yeah. Sentence patterns, sentence structure, all that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the tools of it's the tools in the toolbox. And quite often, because there's so much concentration on that aspect, getting that sentence down right, getting that paragraph down right, building the scene properly, working transitions and getting your transitions done right. There is a kind of not deliberate, but sometimes push to disregard or not worry about the more macro size structural considerations.
mm-hmm.
And it's one of the reasons why short stories are probably the most within fiction, the most effective form to use in a writing workshop, whereas novels are not, right? Because a novel is, if you, even if you're contributing four contributions in a term, that's four chapters. That tells, the people who are reading this, they don't know where this story is going. They can't get a sense of how these things are contributing to the overall structure, because the structure hasn't been written yet, or it's not been seen yet. Short stories, on the other hand, you can within the context of a single class, you can go for your beginning, middle, and end, and take a look and analyze the structure and see all the things that have been put in place in that storytelling, to basically build to that ending. So they're all there in support of that structure, or defining that structure. So it's a slightly different approach. But at the same time, a lot of people will come into a writing program or into a project, and they'll have the big idea, and so they've got that overall story, and they know where it's going, and they know the conclusions, and then they turn around and may end up struggling with that close writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do I get from point A to point F, or whatever, right? And so then, as an instructor, then you have to flip the script in a way. You have to go back to the notions of narrative structure, that terminology list I just gave you, and start looking into that to see how all of these things can, all of these tools can be used in a variety of ways to actually support the creation of that structure and the end of that story.
Because with that, it's almost like the difference between character and characterization that
We were talking about that. Yeah.
we were talking about earlier. Because obviously, a character at its most basic is a function of narrative. So, and the ability to deliver dialogue to the reader, the ability to experience narrative events to illustrate something to the reader. That, at its most basic level, is what the character is. And yet, that has to be married with the creation of depth of character to make that function have a semblance of uniqueness, have a semblance of, or appearance of, depth, complexity, individuality that will engage a reader, because we like to view characters quite often as understandable things that we relate to, i.e., other people. And so that illusion has to be created. So you have a marrying of function with then, which is the sort of the skeleton of what a character is, the underpinning. But that mechanical nature has to be disguised with flesh over it, which would be all of those elements, that both their physicality, the actions, their voice, their dialect, their mannerisms, and all of those things, how you do them and what they are, that is a form of characterization, which isn't the same as character.
No, it's not. And it's funny because if you were to use the word character in that narrative list I gave you, elements of narrative structure, it kind of unfolds beyond its specificity. And what I mean is, you can actually think in terms of character as that which is lying behind narration itself, or the narrator, because the narrator has character. We don't know what it is, but it's there, right? And you can actually start piecing that together. I mean, one of the great things of being in a workshop and being alongside fellow writers for like an entire year is, by the end of it, you've got a fair good sense, on the basis of their stories, their character as narrator. And that's a stance in and of itself. Whereas characterization within that list is about the process of actually creating character, as opposed to character itself.
But on the point of narrator and narratorial point of view, because of course that can get confused with style. So if you think of like Gustav Holst, not Gustav Holst, the guy who wrote the short timers.
Hasford.
Um, and when you think of that first person present tense, very abrupt narrative style, that's the style of narration. The narrator, who we find out is the first person narrator because it's Joker, but that person has to have a different character to not necessarily the narrative style, but the narrative style has to match with what is being conveyed in this. And you can contrast that and compare it with in the Black Company, Croker as narrator, and the difference between Croker as narrator and Croker as character, because they're not quite the same.
Yeah, yeah, but that's yeah, but then as soon as you start talking style, then you're kind of moving into, a whole other aspect of things. Just to step back to that notion of the character of the narrator. Um, my reading of that, and I can see it in my own work because I for some stupid reason, I went back to my copy of A Ruin of Feathers, the first. I had this notion. Okay, here's this bizarre idea. I was going to take and take a photograph because there's no electronic versions of most of these stories. So I was going to take a photograph of the opening, the first page, page one of all, I think there's 12 or 13 stories, and then put that on Facebook and have, people sort of vote which story do you want to see completely photographed and put on my Facebook site. I nixed that idea. And the interesting thing, I'll tell you why, it's weird, but I went back and I was reading that stuff and I could see the character of my narration was as plain as day, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it means is we all have proclivities, we all have tendencies, we all look for the same details in any scene that, we're physically walking through or physically in. And those create a kind of limitation in some sense. And so the approaches, I mean, these were stories set in Central America in 83 with a archaeologist main character, not always first person, but sometimes first person. And I'm seeing the same structure. I'm seeing the same tone, if you will, that's
Mm-hmm.
in the narrator in terms of sentence pattern, sentence strength, sentence length, word choice, metaphor, the analogies I use, the similes I use. I was looking at that and thinking, well, yeah, you can look at this stuff and see the source or the origins of everything that I've written that followed, right? And it was kind of a shock in the sense that I had a sense of, well, these are my limits. These are my limitations are right there in those early short stories. And I simply continue those limitations throughout all these other things. So that is an element of character as narration that is on a completely different level than what we're talking about in terms of character within a story or even character within a story's particular narrative stance.
Right, because like an aspect of this, and it's the construction of author to narrator. Narrator
Mm.
is not necessarily a person, but a narrator will have a position.
Yeah.
So, like one of the ways of trying to explain this, if you are writing a scene where someone walks into a room, the narrator, regardless of whether or not the narrator is a specific character, an individual, or even just a position, like third person, uh, limited to what is going on. So that's not an actual person. But the author has to have the narrator describe the scene. So they will look at the room and what does the narrator pick out as important? Because they're not going to describe everything.
No.
They have to give the reader a sense of what's in the room. But if you take 5 different people, show them all the same room, and tell them to list the most important aspects of that room, or their five most interesting details about that room in order of uh, how interesting they are or order of importance, the lists aren't going to be identical. And that is if you're just describing it objectively, that there's still a selection process going on in what is being shown. And that is going to be shaped by the narrative position. And that narrative position should be, and it's one of the few times I will use should be tied to the purpose of the scene, to where the story is going. All of these different aspects of narrative, that when you have a marrying between the narrative position, the theme and subject of the story, the actions, the type of characters, the sound of the story, the feel of the story, and the word choices being used in it. If all those things marry together, that's where we get to great literature, regardless of whether or not we personally like it, but we can admire the seamless quality of it.
Yeah.
But if that's the aspirational high end, you go, right, that's what I think every author is trying to aim toward. But for whatever reason, we drop down. And then you have terrible literature where, someone is trying to write a gothic supernatural horror, and they go, yes, and the approach I'm going to take is transparent prose that make it very, very accessible. But you're actually reducing the impact that the Gothic can have if you've completely changed the language, and you're now trying to tell that story in a way that isn't emphasizing the aspects, the theme, the style, the approach, the tone, the texture of the Gothic.
Yeah, and so in other words, it requires that the writer actually understand those elements of, well, understand Gothic. And so you have to read that stuff, and then you have to deconstruct that stuff, and you have to sort of figure out how are these things, how are these emotions in the reader being conveyed by virtue of the language of communication. If you then turn around and try to apply a repertorial, transparent prose style to that, it falls to pieces very, very quickly, because the impact of the Gothic is in the language. It's just traditionally, it's in the language.
And yet, I can imagine an author taking that as a challenge to go, right, I'm going to write a journalistic Gothic horror story. And I'm sure if you sat down to do it, but it is making it more difficult because you've just taken away one of the strongest tools to create a sense of the Gothic in the language and approach that you take, if you've changed it to something that's not natural to it.
Yeah.
And so you have to be aware of altering that paradigm. And then how do you find something to sort of fit in that place? How do you evoke that sense in the reader when you've removed the thing that was doing that evoking? You have to find another way to do it. And that's, when we talk about rules, let me just make this one point before you interject. But when we talk about rules, talk about the general principle. And the thing is, authors as artists are inventive. And as soon as someone says you must do it this way, some author is going to find a way around it. But sometimes there's paths of least resistance, and then there are expressions of individuality, and then there's, I am going deliberately against the grain, and therefore I have to be aware of A, what the grain is, B, what other paths people have taken, and in order to create it, you need to understand the effects on the reader, what the original narratives were doing, how they did it, so that you can recreate those effects, but in a completely different way.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I thought or brought up the notion of, or we brought up the notion of transparent prose, and I used the corollary of repertorial. All these um, all these examples of the repertorial style applied to Gothic popped into my head, right? How often do you get a main character in a horror story who is actually a journalist? You do, right? And I mean, one of the classics is, of course, on television. It's Kolchak. It's the what is it, Night Stalker?
Hmm.
Yeah. So he is a reporter. He's a journalist. But of course, the tension that's created is central to that story, which is his grounded disbelief in these things, and then his clashing with the supernatural. And then at the same time, he's also presented as something of a hack writer, anyways, right? So he can fall into that melodramatic narration and very, very effectively. So yeah, there are ways around it, but you certainly need to be conscious of the effects of the style that you are applying to the story itself.
Because when we think about trying to think of a way to express this, the concept of transparent prose, even the idea that the reader isn't seeing the words on the page anymore. They're so immersed that it's just flowing through their head, and it's creating this very vivid picture. You're right. If you have a very high level of literacy and an excellent vocabulary, what is going to be transparent to you is going to be a greater range than someone who has a much lower level of literacy. So if we're defining the type of prose, this transparency, solely on the ability of a reader to become immersed, right? But that's not a particularly useful definition then, because you can't pull every reader. And then when you think of when we talk about literature, we sometimes just default to adult literature. And yet we know that literature is aimed at different groups. And then even within that, you have, is it highly commercial? Because something that is highly commercial is not necessarily going to do things the same way that something that is, and I don't like setting them up as a dichotomy, but toward the artistic and niche expression of something that may not have wide appeal, but can be absolutely stunning and beautiful for those people who are interested in that thing. And genre is genre straddles all of that, because some genre works are highly commercial and others less so, because we're defining genre in that instance then by narrative elements that occur in it and not necessarily audience. And
Yeah, it's very problematic as soon as you start thinking in terms of writing to specific audiences within the context of the specific characteristics of the prose, right? So, by the argument you've just presented there, if you want your works to be absolute bestsellers, you want to lower the diction level so that it's the prose is transparent to readers from age 12 onwards. Um, that is an approach that you can make if the interest is in as large a readership as possible. But I mean, the whole problem, and this is the problem I ran into because I ran into what they call Windexed prose, which is the same thing, transparent. Windex is just a product in North America that you use to clean windows so that birds can fly into them. So Windex was the big thing in Iowa, Windex language. And you're right. There is an implicit judgment that's built into that, and the judgment is actually directed towards the intended audience of this work. And apparently, the intended audience needs to be at a certain educational level, emerging from a particular cultural context, cultural background, and all the rest, aka the New Yorker style of fiction. And that's what was the big thing in Iowa at the time. And I remember sort of railing against it because it really seemed to be conscious effort to truncate the potentiality of language in order to convey in the clearest fashion imaginable the thing that is driving the narrative forward, the story itself, right? So the idea was the reader is not invited to pause and linger on a phrase or on a sentence or a turn of phrase or anything. They are invited to or expected to flow seamlessly, like you say, through the narrative until they reach the denouement. And then the denouement delivers the thematic, emotional impact of the story. And so in that respect, going right back to, you talked about the two approaches to studying literature, being the close reading versus the overall big thing, where you're looking at almost, I guess, a kind of emotional impact of the whole, of the completed work, as being distinct from the close reading of, paragraphs and sentences and all the rest. Iowa was looking at the impact almost exclusively, right? The short story has to deliver that thing at the end. And I found that to be very frustrating, because it's, if you're going to push in that direction, you have to, at the very least, the writer has to understand narrative structure and all the terminology that, refers to that. And if they don't, it's like,
But
it's frustrating.
this is why I find food analogies so useful in the discussion of literature. Because if you remember the whole nouvelle cuisine, sort of the rise of nouvelle cuisine, and then it was the deconstruction of things. And we see these phases go through times of popularity where a particular approach and style, and that is highlighted as this is what we should be aiming towards. And it ignores the fact that regardless of those things, there is a huge variety of all of these other approaches that are still ongoing. And then it's someone suddenly discovers them. And you're like, no, they've been there all along. Like,
all along.
And then we see the rise and fall of these different approaches in food. And that's what's being aimed for. In literature, we see the same sort of thing, that, when we look at Hemingway, and people put, oh, but look at Hemingway's prose, it's transparent prose. But it's not basic. Hemingway's writing is extraordinarily complex. It just has the appearance of simplicity. It's not simplistic prose. Simplistic prose is an entirely different thing. But with Hemingway, and so much of it is implied storytelling, because he liked that idea of just chopping out things and implying them to the reader and giving the inference of something, because what the reader was then constructing in their mind was far more detailed and persuasive and emotive than anything he could put on the page. And it's a very effective technique. But Faulkner expressed it in a very, very different way. And with Faulkner, you wouldn't look at the language of Faulkner and the language of Hemingway and go, oh, well, these two are both doing the same thing. But again, there's that same very careful consideration of word choice, that same careful consideration of sentence length, of paragraph structure, of the beginning, the middle, and end of a chapter, of what particular points of view are seeing, how the language is constructed. They have, in some respects, radically different approaches. But we see the same care and attention and understanding of effect and impact. And yet, would you say that Faulkner's writing is Windex, is transparent?
No. And, at the time, I guess maybe in intellectual circles, there was the battle for American literature was Faulkner on one side and Hemingway on the other. And I guess one could say that Hemingway won that battle, but only in a general sense, because Southern American fiction writing embraced the Faulkner approach. Yeah. But of course,
we mentioned the Gothic earlier. You have the Southern Gothic.
Southern Gothic, yeah. And so, but so much was being dictated out of the primary magazines that were producing, or rather showing fiction, short fiction. So you would have had the New Yorker, you would have had Harper's, you would have had Esquire, the East Coast, the Northeast Coast magazines. So Faulkner's side of things basically didn't have the same outlet for that kind of dissemination of a particular style. And then, people like Carver, followed on to that. So, and it's funny because, coming from Canada, this was a foreign world, in the literary sense. Because the Canadian literary landscape was far more fragmented. Um, I mean, it did have its equivalent. It had its Toronto slash Montreal bias. Um, but then you had, I mean, Toronto was very much the New Yorker style, and maybe Montreal, because of the French influence, was leaning in the other direction. Um, so yeah, maybe there's a parallel there. But then you had prairie writing, which was completely different from everything else. And then you had mountain writing, which is even more different. So when I got to Iowa, it was I had to. It took me half the first year to sort of ground myself into the lexicon that was being used and the approach that was being taken towards fiction.
But, I was thinking even within the sort of the evolution of the genre, when you can compare and contrast, say, the approaches taken in the Conan stories and the Barzoom stories. And,
Hmm.
some people, particularly from the modern day, where, so much of what we read is in a journalistic style because it's electronic. It's all of these short articles, it's text messages, it's email. We're used to reading in short, direct styles. And therefore, looking at something that is written in a different style appears different. But if you've read lots of that stuff, you're so familiar with it that you fall into it. And it's the evocation. So when you think of Conan and the language being used to evoke a sense of the mythic, to evoke that archaic age. And it's almost like putting a sepia filter across the world that changes how we see the objects in front of us, making the mundane fantastic. But the language is used to express that. And then when you look at Barzoom, a different filter is being used because there's a science fictional element to that that isn't in the Conan stories. Even though some of the techniques may be similar, their expression is actually slightly different. And like in my head, I always think of fantasy writing being more soft and tapestry in terms of texture, whereas science fictional writing tends to be more metallic and sharp. Even though, like, it's really weird. That's how it is in my head. And getting anyone else to see that's impossible
Mm.
because my brain processes it. But then you think of Lovecraft and that otherworldly horror. And yeah, people might point to those three things and go, all three of them, purple prose. But they're so radically different in approach. What is this commonality? That they are all not that thing. Congratulations, we have identified that they are all not that one thing, like everything else that is not that one thing.
Well, the whole attribution of purple prose I find problematic anyways.
Yeah.
So it's but I think that is actually deriving out of the post Hemingway mindset, isn't it? You know, where if the language is mannered in any fashion or in any way, um, or over exuberant. Iowa was very much about understatement of absolutely everything. Um, and of course, the quickest path to understatement is to take out the scalpel and start editing line by line by line. So um, yeah, I've always sort of, I mean, Burroughs and the Barsoom stuff was, I would say, is emerging from a very different tradition than the Howard stuff. And it was more romantic adventure than anything else. But if you look technically, say at Tarzan of the Apes, the first book, or Princess of Mars, but part, I think in some ways he probably spent more time on Tarzan of the Apes than he did the first book than he did on Princess of Mars. Well, it's a longer book, um, but the particular style being used there, um, there's nothing purple about it. It's actually pretty impressive. It's an impressive style. It's probably dated now. But even there, it's these are moving goalposts for us writers, right? Because um, to this day, I'm seeing like on Facebook and stuff, if somebody posts a comment on, say, Toll the Hounds, somebody is going to show up in on the list of commentators saying, well, if they cut two-thirds of it or a third of it, it would have been a much better book. So one still faces this kind of the approach of less is more somehow, or um, the the author's choice to slow things down or immerse oneself into something in a much more measured fashion can elicit impatience in the reader. So,
But if
move
you
forward.
think of the modern preoccupation with tell me the thing quickly, tell me the thing as efficiently as possible, so now I have consumed the thing and I can move on to the next thing.
Mm.
That we've moved into a sense of consumption of narrative rather than the enjoyment of narrative. We go, yeah, I enjoy reading. It's like, no, do you enjoy reading or do you enjoy having read? That you've enjoyed consuming the narrative, that you now know what happened. Because the number of times we see online, can you just tell me what happened in it? I don't want to
Mhm.
bother reading the series. Just give me the highlights. There, there are entire apps now being developed of you don't need to read the book. We've summarized the book for you. So you can just take away the central nuggets of it. But okay, and that's certainly one approach to narrative, this consumption of, oh, well, I know what the major points are. But it's not generally what we have done in the history of humanity with the enjoyment of art and the experience of art and the experience of narrative. That it's not
Yeah.
necessarily about the most absolutely efficient, time efficient, and concise way of getting across a point. It's about the
Well,
exploration.
yeah, but I mean, a lot of our education system pointed us in that direction, right? It trained us. We had the Canadian equivalent of Cliff Notes. I don't know what they were called, Coal Notes, where we were.
And
So
York,
basically, yeah, it was, the classic work summarized and the salient points brought out and little mini essay discussions and all the rest on how to interpret all these things. And if you're doing that in a class where you didn't really want to read the book anyways, I mean, it's the perfect resource to get through it and to get past it. Now, the weird thing is, why would you take that approach to things that you purportedly enjoy reading, right? It makes no sense at that point because this isn't the whole process of reading the book the the reason for why you crack the spine. It's like,
you want to
why
sit
would you
down, you
jump to
want to
the end,
read, you
right?
want to enjoy, you want
Yeah.
to go along with it. And it's, well, this could have been faster. I
Yeah,
get
I
it.
get that all the time.
You go, yeah, it could have been.
Could have.
It also could have been slower. It could have been
Hmm.
even longer. That,
Hmm.
that's an equal possibility out of the two.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a strange commentary to make on a work. To me, it's more valid to say I found the pace of this to be too slow. Fair enough, right? But to say it could have been cut begs the question of who does the cutting and why, and for what purpose. And do you cut a work to satisfy reader A, but frustrate
Reader B.
readers? Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But the thing is, we do it on a micro scale. Because if you think when you're looking at a sentence or when you're looking at a paragraph, and sometimes you go, oh, right, that's if instead of those four words, if I cut those four words out, I can replace it with this one word that is delivering the same thing. And then you look at your paragraph and go, well, that's actually repetitious of something. And I can include that information more succinctly if it's included here and it's actually going to have more impact or be more powerful. And that, you know, we think of that concision in writing, that we don't want the words smeared across the page and they're only a fraction deep. What we want is depth implied by what is on the page to be enriching. And so there is a balance in that when we look at sentences, you go, okay, this sentence is 96 words long. Why is it 96 words long? Is there a good reason for it being 96 words long and made up of 5 different clauses? And if there's a reason for it, is there a way to achieve that point with the same level of impact and to create the same effect in fewer words? And like, what was the, but
Mm, 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 mm. I would argue that's an academic approach. It's an essaytorial approach. And I would argue against using an essay analytical approach on fiction. When you're writing fiction, I'd say don't use it.
See, fundamentally, there's stuff that I've looked at, and I've looked at the paragraph, and I've gone, okay, you've expressed 3 points in 3 sentences. You can actually express all 3 points in one sentence, and it actually makes it more impactful because I'm thinking about how a reader is processing the information. So why don't you want that level of impact? And that's, again, I think there's always a balance between artistic expression and voice, and thinking about it in terms of the person that is reading it. There
Yeah.
has to be a balance between the two.
Yeah. But of course, you're talking about sort of a story having reached a stage where it's being given to somebody to edit or read, etc.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the creative process. Should probably avoid that at all costs. You don't want your self-editing, essaytorial, academic approach
Oh,
to be applying itself to the creative process. So if you do 3 sentences in a paragraph that are all effectively saying kind of the same thing, that's fine for the first draft, right? In other words, later on, you come back to it and you go, and now you start thinking and applying the analytical eye to it, and you're thinking, well, that was a really cool subclause, in that sentence, and I like the analogy in this sentence, and I like the word choice, in this section, this clause of this section, this sentence. Is there a way to actually evoke all of those things, or do you say all 3 approaches are good in and of themselves, but approach number 2, the second sentence, actually feeds better into the rest of the narrative in that section, and then you can start cutting and removing things.
oh, what a surprise that the academic editor is thinking about things from that perspective, and you're going, no, but you don't do that when you're creating it. I'm like, I know, but
Yeah. I
and
know,
this,
but I think one of the issues is a beginning writer can think that that's how they have to approach the creation of a work, right? That every sentence has to be perfect before I move on to the next one.
no, get it down on paper first.
Yeah. Get
Because
it down.
once it's down on paper, you can go back to it as much as you want. But if you never get it down on paper, then you're never going to be finished. It has to be down on paper.
Mhm.
But thinking about it from a reader's perspective, quite often, like when we read, we go, I didn't enjoy that book. It was far too slow for me. But it takes a certain kind of mindset to take this was far too slow for me and translate that into this book should have been faster for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that universalizing of our expectations, bias, and preference. You're right. We may feel that way, but do we really have the right to dictate to everyone else how the book should be? And you're like, and that's where I fundamentally quite often come down on disagreeing with a lot of these things, because I can read a book and someone else can read it and they'll go, this was far too long. It could have been shorter. They could have got to the point faster. And you're like, yes, they could have. What's your point? Oh, well, I would have enjoyed it more if it was shorter. And you're like, okay, so they should have made it shorter. No, no, because, well, if they had made it shorter, then me that enjoyed it at the length that it was and how it was expressed, I'm going to be dissatisfied because it's going to feel hurt. And it could have been more
Yeah.
expressed. It could have taken its time.
Yeah.
It could have
But the
built.
assumption also is within that, that critique, that a shorter version would have been more enjoyable.
Quite often it's
That's
not.
a huge assumption, right?
Yeah.
Especially if what is being built within that narrative is everything that the author felt was needed to deliver the maximum emotional impact at the end of that story. If you start cutting that stuff out, you're not going to get that emotional impact.
But you start lessening it. Every line that you cut out, you're moving events closer together because you're shortening the narrative space between them. That the time that a reader reads the first event and then gets the second one, that's been shortened as well, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
you haven't been thinking about it as long. It hasn't been sitting at the back of your head and and marinating for as long.
Yeah.
Like these are all considerations, and that's why when people say, "Oh, this book isn't for everyone," you're like, "Congratulations! That is one of the most asinine things to say because no book is for everyone."
No.
And you tried to disagree with that. Said Winnie the Pooh. You're like, okay, exception that proves the rule. Fine,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but the whole I wouldn't recommend this book to everyone. You're like, well, no, there is no book I would recommend to everyone because some people like science fiction, some people like horror, some people like spy thrillers, some people like just weird, esoteric, the new weird stuff.
Yeah. Well, Winnie the Pooh, I think you could recommend to everyone.
I hate you.
Mm.
It completely undermines my argument, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. But
Um,
he does that, right? Winnie does that.
and yet, this whole idea of, oh well, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, as if it is some insightful comment about a text.
I know.
It's not. It's vacuous. Like it is an empty phrase. But what is generally intended by that is this is a very niche text rather than being for a general audience. But built into that assumption is that we as reader are representative of the general audience because
Apparently.
again we universalize our perspective. Just as a general rule, we why we think the things that we think because we think we are right. if
Mhm.
if we thought that we were wrong, we would probably change the things that we think. Our base assumption is that we are right and we are normal and we are representative of common sense and the norm and the average person because, well, of course everyone sees the world this way, and yet
Mhm.
we fundamentally know that this is not true, that we are unique individuals, that we have biases, preferences, ideologies, cultures, politics, all manner of aspects that make us different from the average reader. And yet we make assumptions that what we would prefer is going to be what the average reader prefers.
Mhm.
And it's sometimes a very frustrating thing to deal with when
Mhm.
you're trying to explain it. You go, but how can you say, oh, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone? You're like, yeah, it's a fantasy novel. Lots of people don't read fantasy. Why would you recommend a fantasy novel to people who don't read and don't like fantasy?
Yeah.
But we've drifted somewhat away from
Mm.
where we started, which is
Yeah.
the norm for our conversations, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, style is just to go back to that, the conflation of prose and style. They're in different strata, right? Prose is a far more general, descriptive um, term. Style is very much part of narrative structure. So it's sitting beneath. It's style is a component of prose, not the other way around, right? So
Yeah, prose is essentially how the thing that is being communicated. That the words on the page, all of them, that is the prose. And then we start breaking it into different ways of looking at it and analyzing parts of it. But ultimately, and again, this is something that it's quite difficult to get across, like in a YouTube video where you go, oh, I want to talk about this thing. All elements of narrative are interrelated and overlap. That it is very difficult to pick apart and go, right, I am just looking at this one specific element because the
mhm.
other elements are all there. It's and part of the reason for this is often we're looking at a finished published work. And that is the equivalent of taking a bowl of soup that has been prepared in a kitchen by an expert chef. And you have this bowl of soup and you go, right, I'm going to analyze the use of vegetables and I'm going to pick them all out. But the vegetables that you pick out of the soup are still going to have part of the seasoning on it and they'd have been cut in a certain way. All of those elements have still shaped them. And that can be very difficult because you go, right, I want to talk about this one thing. And someone go, well, what about that? Yes, that is not the thing that I am talking about. That is a different thing. It is related, as all things in narrative typically are, and it has an impact on this because
Mhm.
the narrative considers all of the different things. But
Well, yeah, it's more the case of, if somebody says they don't pay attention to the prose, well, if you read the book, you paid attention to the prose. It's as simple as that,
I'm
right? The act of reading is paying attention to the prose. But if you want to talk about style, that's a whole different beast. And and that can be quite interesting because you can apply style to all almost all levels of narrative structure. So but it is quite amorphous. It's not an easy thing to pin down. Um,
Well, you can look for particular structures that an author employs. You can
yeah.
look at pacing, if there are pacing patterns or content patterns that an author employs, or if there are particular narrative elements such as characters or archetypes or tropes or sequences that are stylistically associated with that author because they like to use them. Do you remember David Gemmell's Catching the Stone in the Moonlight?
Yeah, but I don't know if I would call that.
It wasn't a style issue. It was
It's not a style issue. Yeah.
but it was a repetition
Yeah.
of a particular moment and concept that obviously he liked because he thought it expressed something
Oh
quite.
man, I don't know how many million words I've written, but if I'm just even now if I'm describing a scene, I'm thinking, shit, have I already written that somewhere? Probably. And I mean, what can you do, right? You don't know if that
Well,
turn of phrase
there,
is
I'm sure there are turns of phrase that you use and like because it's where your mind naturally goes.
yeah.
But you typically don't reuse entire scenes.
No, I don't reuse entire scenes. But I think quite often the setting description um are looking at the same things. And this is what I found in these early um, stories of mine was that how I constructed and the details I use in evoking, creating a scene were very similar. I recognized them. Let's put it that way.
And that's it. When new authors are looking at, what should I do in order to do this? And sometimes it almost like there's a checklist. Have I constructed the physical scene in which the characters are standing so they're not just in a white space? Have I evoked at least 3 of 5 senses in creating that scene to make it more vivid? Have I broken up the dialogue with sometimes with tags and sometimes with action to provide variety? Right, you can look at it in terms of a checklist. But if you started every single chapter that way, it doesn't matter how well that you have done it because unless you're trying to deliberately evoke that sense of repetition with every single chapter, which some authors will have done for some particular reason, it'll just come across as repetitious. And you go, no, you need to change things up. You can't always start with a paragraph of physical description followed by one character addressing another character.
Yeah.
It, there
But
has to be
but but the interesting thing is I'd recommend that process for beginning writers. Get all that stuff so that it is muscle memory. Because then you can start manipulating things around, you can shift things around because you're comfortable of the requirements that you feel are needed to write that section or to convey that story. But now you can start messing around with it. But you need to have actually get the muscle memory first. So applying the 5 senses as often as you can, absolutely. It helps immerse the reader. It also wakens you up as the writer to those particular phenomena that are out there that are part of the scene, which helps create verisimilitude and all the rest. So, um, but and of course, once you've got all that stuff, and it just takes years to do, right? It's there's no shortcuts in this stuff to get the muscle memory. Then you can start messing around with 2 characters in white space, and then you know have the conversation going on, and then 3 paragraphs down is where you land on the scene and provide the environment in which they're speaking. Um,
or as you have done on a couple of times, that is one of the things that you do that always drives me nuts. Have a conversation between 2 characters, and only at the end of the conversation do you reveal who the characters were. I'm like, oh, shit that.
Yeah, I don't do that as much anymore because you had a point, and I discovered it as well when I would read back on stuff. Um, but of course, then as you've seen in an early draft of the novel I'm writing right now, I went overboard with narrative style. I got that one young character who narrates everything around him, and ended up basically plagiarizing himself for the new scene. And I guess we're probably going to end up cutting that out, but because I know that really irritated you, didn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I again, yeah, it went on too long.
Mm,
If it had been the start of it and I recognized it, and then it had broken into action of what the hell are you writing, or obviously an appropriate swear,
mm.
but and it's then you realize that that's what he is doing, then I think it would have worked just as well. But the thing was, it was like a whole section. I'm just going, I
No, I think it was 2 or 3 paragraphs before I
it
cut
felt longer.
it. I'm sure it did. Yeah.
Well, okay,
Yeah, I was messing around. It's probably one of the things that sort of got me off track with this novel because I was messing around with narrative in a fairly meta fashion. So
and those are I think those are brilliant exercises that authors should indulge themselves with. It's whether or not it ends up in the finished
yeah,
book is a different thing. Because you look at some of the modernist short story writing, where it's can I write a narrative without character? Can I write a narrative without character and without action? Can I write? And it's through the expression of those things and attempting them that I think authors learn the boundaries of what they can push, what they can break, what has to be bent but not broken. If you break that one thing over there, then you need to bolster this thing over here.
yeah.
Playing around with it.
That I remember being taught that really early by that same instructor. He said, all of these things, these elements in narrative structure that I mentioned earlier, um, they're not hard and fast rules, but what they are is those elements in narrative that had withstood the test of time. And having done so, their appearance is basically subconsciously expected by the reader. So as that is constituting a story, right? You need those elements like setting and character and voice and diction, all this kind of stuff. Um, and then what he said was, now you can take something out, you can experiment with that and remove some elements. But what you find is you need to replace it with something else. And as long as you're replacing it with something else, then there's enough there that is intrinsically recognized as story for the reader to
Mhm.
engage in. But
Yeah.
if you pull them out and in the absence of replacing them with anything, then it feels incomplete to the reader, in which case you've messed up. It may be fun to do as an exercise, but that's indulgent because it's an exercise. Okay, you've done it. You don't want to ever show that to an actual reader.
Unless there's an effect that you can achieve with it that
Sure.
is in service of the thing that you are doing, the
Yeah.
narrative that you are creating.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's a great Zelazny story that goes backwards in time, sentence by sentence.
and uh, Martin Amis did that with Time's Arrow.
Yeah.
But the narrator is viewing time running backwards. So the narrator is actually the same time frame that we are, and playing with that.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because for the Zelazny story, I can't remember what it's called, but I think it almost evokes the notion of the sentences being actually inverted, mirror image sentences, but they aren't. It's just the time sequence of the events within that sentence are reversed. Yeah, it's
And
pretty cool.
yeah, and it's being aware of those things. You go, right, so I'm going to use this technique. But if you think like in M. Banks' Fearsome Engine,
Mm.
having one of the points of view in idiomatic, dialectic stream of consciousness. And you could look at that almost as, but that's a creative writing exercise. Can you do this whole thing? But it worked as part of that novel because the other three weren't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker would be something similar in that fashion, or Clockwork Orange for that matter, in some
Or
ways.
Catcher in the Rye, where there's a really strong sense of Holden's voice and him telling a story in an idiomatic way. Because,
Salinger, yeah.
or
Yeah.
Salinger, yeah, sorry. But that Holden Caulfield's voice in that, where it's how he tells the story. And so you get Salinger coming across using that technique, which, that's not the most concise way to do it. It's not clean, transparent. It's getting the voice of the character, and that adds to the depth of the narrative.
Yeah, I still didn't like the novel. Highly overrated. But anyways, that's me.
And on that controversial bombshell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ridley Walker, on the other hand, was pretty extraordinary. I stumbled onto that one actually fairly late, just
But
decades ago.
like almost in terms of that, the detective noir, you can do detective, or you can do a detective story without using the noir language. And yet, if someone uses that language and that time period and that setting, and then the archetypes that fit into it, you instinctively relax into the story because it's the expected room temperature of a detective noir. It's going to do all of those things. And if that was written in very uh, very modern, clean, technical essay language, it
Yeah.
it wouldn't feel right, and so the author would have to do something else to evoke the sense of the detective noir.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Interesting.
when, why don't we leave it there, Steve? Thank you very much for this
Sure.
conversation.
Yeah.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.